Hi, everybody. Whoever's listening to this, thanks very much for joining me. So my name's Luke, and this is the 10th, I think, CRAE lecture. So thanks so much to CRAE for inviting me. So I suppose I ought to start off really with a bit of a trigger warning. So you can read my positionality and why I think I know what I've got to say is worth listening to. You can wait in about 40 minutes time, you can decide for yourself. But the trigger warning reads thus: my hypothesis is that there is a pervasive and invidious pattern of thought, behaviour and belief that is at the heart of a societal norm that is in effect destroying autistic lives. Sounds quite dramatic, I recognise that, and I don't utter those words lightly. I think that there's an unconscious bias within general society that puts autistic people as lesser human beings. And I'm going to try and justify that. And I think the scary thing is that it is an unconscious bias. People aren't even aware that that is essentially what we're doing. Almost from cradle to grave. And I'm not talking about you personally. I'm sure, well, I'm not sure, I don't know who you are, but I'm hoping you personally are fantastic individuals who support autistic people and enjoy autistic people in the same way as everybody else. But society in general does not see autism in the way that perhaps they should. So this presentation is optimistic, I hope, but we have to go through the current state of play as it is before we get on to the fun bits. So Autopia is my autistic utopia, my vision, if you like, for the future, what life is going to be like when we've got everything right. Okay, that's what we need to be aiming for. But before we get to where we need to be, we need to work out where we are now. So this is the depressing bit first, and then we'll get on to the fun bits in a bit. So as I say, I think that there's this general understanding or general view, however unconscious it might be, of autistic people as lesser human beings, as second-class citizens. And I will try and rationalise that as I go along. This can be avoided relatively easily and for very little cost with extraordinary reward. You can change things. You can change things overnight. You can take down your posters in your school that have got the heading autistic spectrum disorder, for example. Why are we telling human beings that they're disordered? Is that not just one example of a multitude, a plethora, a myriad of examples that we can give of where we are treating autistic people as lesser? And I put this out on Twitter once. Please, can all autism resources take down their posters? Now, we often say, oh, this is great, autism awareness, this is fantastic. And you go into resources and you've got, what is autism, or what is autistic spectrum disorder? And you've got autistic kids attending those resources in black and white, being told on a day-to-day basis, every time they go into that space, you are a disordered human being. What does that do to the self-esteem? What does that tell the autistic child? What does that tell the parent of the autistic child? Almost everything we do, right from the beginning, even part of the diagnostic process. Why are we diagnosing as opposed to identifying? I'll perhaps come on to this in a bit, but even the diagnostic process itself, you need a GP referral. We go to the GP when we think there's something wrong with us and we want it fixing. So even at that subconscious level, what does that say to the parent of a suspected autistic child? You need a GP referral because we think there might be something wrong with your child and we need to get it fixed. And I'm not saying that that's what the system globally is suggesting, but there's got to be those elements of, well, what does that mean to me as a parent then? If I've got to get a GP referral for an assessment, does that mean inherently there's something wrong with my child that needs fixing? And if that's how I as a parent view autism and view my child, where does that leave me? And where does that leave my child? Anyway, I ought to get on with the talk, hadn't I? So in terms of terms, autism, not with autism. I view being autistic as an intrinsic part of being human, of being a person, not an add-on or something that, there's a human first and then there's this sort of add-on that is autism. And I'm just going really with the majority of autistic people who state a preference refer to me as autistic, not a person with autism. Even something as simple as that. We're in a position where I'm giving you this talk and I'm the only person, I think, giving the talk. I feel sorry for people who follow on from me at conferences if I'm doing the first talk and I say, why don't professionals listen to autistic people? It's crystal clear. The surveys that have been done, there's fantastic online surveys. Chris Bonelli's survey comes to mind. The Kenny et al. Paper in 2016, the surveys state a very clear preference from the autistic community to refer to themselves as autistic, not a person with autism. There are some people who prefer person with autism, but the vast majority, the overwhelming majority, prefer autistic person. So why is the rest of the world not listening to those people? And then the poor person who comes on after me, all their slides say person with autism. But why are we not listening to the very community that we are talking about? I refer to the non-autistic population as the predominant neurotype. If you want to know why, read my thesis. No, don't have to read my thesis. Read page 185 for my thesis. I think it goes on to page 186. You can worry about that. You don't need to worry about reading the whole thing. When I am talking about me, not the views of anybody else. So it's just my opinion, really. Don't get upset. So I'm not having a go at you because I don't even know who you are. We is society in general, not you necessarily, but just society in general. I've put today I'm Luke, not an academic stroke professional. So I'm just doing this in my own time for a bit of fun. Okay, so where we are now, and these are just examples. So you can't go to a conference without falling over somebody, not literally, but falling over somebody who comes out with, if you've met one individual with autism, you've met one individual with autism, or paraphrasing something along those lines. Dr. Stephen Shaw, fantastic individual, and came out with this years ago, and really trying to get people to understand the individuality. Now, and everybody goes, yay, brilliant. And I sit there thinking, why do we still, to this day, need to be reminded that autistic people are actual individual people? Why do we need reminding? Are we still in such a state that we have to remind ourselves that autistic people are individual human beings? We have Autism Awareness Day, week, month. Why do we need to be aware of these human beings? What's wrong with autism acceptance, autism understanding, how to promote autistic well-being, rather than let's be aware that there are these individuals round and about? Mainstream autism theories almost invariably are medical model deficit base. You are impaired. You have a deficit. This is where you're going wrong. And that's how we're going to theorize you and describe autism. Lesser human beings. Okay? Theory tends to go down that deficit-based medical model route. Now, this is a direct quotation, so don't have a go at me, from the NICE guidelines, which suggest or tell us, do not prescribe medication to address the core features of autism. Consider other treatments such as psychosocial interventions. So it's kind of good that it acknowledges you don't medicate people for being autistic. But I still think, why do we even need that as a guideline? Surely we know that you don't pop a pill for a person and all of a sudden it stops them being autistic. I mean, anyway, but going back to consider other treatments such as psychosocial interventions, and this definition okay, about psychosocial intervention, states, when a person is not interacting with society well, psychosocial intervention may be used to help guide the person back into a healthy state of being. So being autistic presumably means, according to this, that they're not a healthy state of being. Continues, that is the use of non-medicinal means to alter a person's behaviours and relationships with society in order to reduce the impact of the person's disorder or condition. Imagine you're an autistic person listening to that. So apparently, being autistic, NICE guidelines suggest psychosocial intervention, which helps guide the person back into a healthy state of being. So apparently being autistic means you're not in a healthy state of being, and you need to change your behaviour and your relationship with society. Why? There's nothing wrong with being autistic. Nothing wrong with being autistic at all. I'm not suggesting that being autistic doesn't come with its own problems, but being autistic per se is not a problem. Being autistic within current society may be hugely problematic and traumatic and all of those sorts of things, which I'm going to come on to. But being autistic should not mean that general society is seeking to stop people being autistic. What they should be doing is seeking a better society that understands autistic people so that being autistic is no longer problematic to the individual. Carrying on, in terms of, according to DSM-5, published in 2013, to be autistic, you may be regarded as having persistent deficits, significant impairments, and having disturbances. This is the narrative. This is the terminology. These are the words that, as an autistic person, if you wanted to, you could read about yourself. That's a disgrace, in my view, that we are telling autistic people that you have persistent deficits. Deficits in what? Deficits in not being autistic. That's all it means. We, society, is essentially saying this is the norm, this is the best, this is the predominant neurotype, and if you're not part of that, then you are the one that is in the wrong. You have a deficit compared to this so-called whatever it might be, the predominant neurotype. Significant impairments, you're disturbed as a human being. This is why I get so upset, angry, stressed, whatever it might be, within current society, and reading this sort of terminology and just thinking to myself, what is happening to the autistic population as a direct result of this kind of discourse? We are destroying autistic lives, and we need to do something about it. So my mini poem, which is absolutely horrific, not in terms of its what it's trying to say, but in terms of it being a poem, is absolutely awful. So forgive me. Conform to the norm or be deemed in the wrong. I mean, as I said, I warned you, it's absolutely terrible. But that is essentially what society is saying. If you don't conform to being the same as everybody else, you are seen as in the wrong. You are seen as the one that needs fixing, needs to be more like everybody else. That's a horrible message to get across to a population. The concept, you are a lesser human being. You need to get better. You need to be more like everybody else. No, we're getting it so wrong within society if that's the message that we're perpetuating. I've put a reminder to self, if they seem nice, tell them what you didn't dare include in the presentation. I don't know if you're nice or not, so I'm not going to tell you. All about stop playing with autistic mice. Anyway, we'll move on. Okay, so going on to Autopia. So in the future, by the way, I ought to say, look, I'm absolutely, and I mentioned this earlier, but I'm absolutely categorically not pretending that being autistic is all fun and games. Okay, we know that that's not the case, but I'm absolutely adamant that that's because we in society are getting it wrong for autistic people, not just as a direct result of being autistic in and of itself. I'm going to come on to my golden equation in a bit. There's a slide later on about it. So getting on to autopia. In the future, our autopia is when you say to somebody, I am autistic, the narrative is never. And don't underestimate the frustration all the way through to trauma that this can cause the autistic person. Imagine you say something very personal about yourself to your neighbour, and they come back with a response that negates what it is that you've just told them, as if they know you better than you know yourself. How would that make you feel? And yet, so many these responses are so common to autistic people, as if the rest of the world knows them better than they know themselves, or they just come up with something that is so inane that it's soul destroying, that the world genuinely doesn't understand you to this degree. So the most obvious one in response to, oh, did you know I'm autistic? But you don't look autistic. I mean, I'm sorry, but where on earth did that come from? What's an autistic person supposed to look like? It's interesting, if you hear somebody say, oh, but you don't look autistic, and you go back to the person and say, well, what does an autistic person look like then? They're stumped. So why say it? It's the most bizarre thing to say in response to, oh, did you know I'm autistic? But you're nothing like my friend's son or the equivalent. It always makes me laugh. You think, oh, you know, oh, so-and-so has suggested there. Oh, you're nothing like da-da-da. Why would I be like somebody who's a different gender and is 30 years younger than me? Why do you really think we're all just exactly the same? It's a very odd thing to come back with. But you're a woman. Okay, let's move on. Yes, there are autistic women out there. Whoa, gasp. But sometimes some people still seem to think it's predominantly a male-orientated part of being human. I suspect there are just as many autistic women as there are men. But you're an adult. This is this kind of thing that, oh, you're an autistic, but you grow out of it. Bizarre. But you seem so caring. That one's a bit heartbreaking, isn't it? That there's a societal perception that being autistic means that you don't care about others. Oh, by the way, I can't remember if it's in this presentation or not. Can we get rid of this notion that autistic people lack empathy? It's a vile thing to apply to a human, to suggest, oh, because you're autistic, you can't empathise. And it's just not true. In fact, some autistic people would say the opposite, that they might over-empathise or empathise to a degree that's painful to them. Anyway, I'm not going down the road of turning this into a lecture about autism theory. This is about autopia. But yeah, please, let's knock that one on the head to suggest that being autistic automatically means you can't empathise with anybody else. Okay, but certainly caring. What's caring got to do with being autistic? Absolutely nothing. But you can read and write. So what? But you can talk to me, as if autistic people can't talk ever. This one really gets me. And this was a parent told me about this. In fact, I wrote a blog article based on this, and she got so fed up with telling people about her children being autistic and their responses being, but your children are so lovely. Why would that ever be a response? So-and-so is autistic. Well, they can't be. They're too lovely. Again, what does that say to you as an autistic person? Society thinks you can't be lovely. And these are common responses. But you've got a good job, but you're married, but you're rubbish at maths, music, IT. Well, that really annoys autistic people. This is one of my favourites, but you've got kids. Where do you think they're coming from? Anyway, you can look at my eyes. All of these myths, and the list could go on and on and on. So, autopia means all of these are eradicated and we don't get those responses. Okay, I mentioned this earlier on. when autism, so autopia is when autism becomes an identity rather than a medical diagnostic label. So no longer are we perpetuating this myth that being autistic means you need to be medically labelled as deficient, but you can be nice and simply identified as autistic. Okay. Is the equality duty discriminatory? So I don't think I can spend too long on this. I'm just checking the time. I'm halfway through my time already. Autopia recognises the importance of self-identification. Okay, if you self-identify as autistic, I don't see any reason why that isn't just as valid as any other process. Some people would argue, oh no, you need a medical professional. My view is you probably know yourself better than anybody else. If you genuinely believe you are autistic, then the chances are very likely that you are. You don't need a medical diagnosis to be gay or to be Catholic or whatever it might be. So my view is, okay, let's rethink about how we understand how people identify themselves. Autopia, I've made this clear though, also recognises the need for some people to access expertise to understand who they are. I don't necessarily think that this should always or invariably be medical professionals though, but I'm not a clinician, so I should steer clear maybe of going down that road. But lots of autistic people say to me, I resent the fact that I have to go to a medical professional to be told who I am. I already know who I am, but I'm not allowed by society to tell everybody who I am, or they don't believe me until I've gone down that medical route. Now, in terms of is the equality duty discriminatory in and of itself? If you're not allowed, in inverted commas, to be discriminated against until you've got that medical diagnosis, and it's difficult to get that identity, and we know it is, particularly for adults, children and adults, but in adults quite often there's a waiting list, for example, of sometimes years, certainly months, before you even get an assessment, and we know that lots of adults find it difficult to get that identification. Then does that put the autistic individual at a substantial disadvantage on day-to-day living in terms of not being able to seek those reasonable adjustments? So just something to think about. Okay, Autopia's identification systems are for those who choose it, are timely, and understand that for some, waiting times are akin to putting life on hold. This is something I think is really important. We need to understand that when an autistic, particularly an autistic adult, comes to that conclusion, oh, I think I'm autistic, right, I need to do something about it, and I really, really, really want that verification from the expert, then actually for some people, their life literally is on hold until they get that final corroboration. Now, if that waiting time is 2 years, that's 2 years of life that's on hold. Not healthy at all. And the identification systems are built entirely around individual need. So in the future, if a person was to say, okay, and it's self-referred, so you don't need to go to the GP. Okay, I've sent an email off, and the first email I get back asks me a series of questions. How do I like to be communicated with? Is it okay to phone? If I do need to phone you, do you need me to send a text first? Or would you prefer if I phone somebody else? Or do you prefer Zoom? Are you nocturnal? Would you prefer if I linked up with you at midnight rather than during the usual working day? Do you need photos of me before you meet me? Would you prefer never to meet me face to face because it's too anxiety inducing for you? What would be best suited to you in order to make this journey as enjoyable to you as possible? And those are the series of questions that are just standard as norm, so that we reduce anxiety as much as possible and involve the individual right from the outset with that level of respect that currently we don't tend to afford. There's a rejection of deficit-based models in its entirety, and there's just a celebration of the diverse nature of humankind. So Autopia's 3 golden nuggets. I like things in threes. So I think this is absolutely crucial. First and foremost, Awesome in and of itself doesn't mean anything apart from being autistic. It's awesome plus environment that equals outcome. And that outcome can be awful, it can be fabulous for the same person. Okay. I could go on and on and on about this, about how I would reject the notion of functioning labels, for example, because an autistic person, anybody actually, can function perfectly well in one environment, but not anywhere near as well in another. But they're the same person. So overall, what does that mean in terms of their functioning? It's the environment has got to be taken into account. Now, if you accept the fact that you can't stop somebody being autistic, which we can't, and nor should we want to, then the only thing left to change is the environment. So I think we should stop, or the focus should be on the environment in which a child or adult finds themselves. What can we do within that environment to make the outcome better, rather than the focus always being on the individual? Second, I've got to go through these quickly because I'm going to run out of time. Golden concept. Predominant neurotype concepts need to be translated before they're applied to the autistic individual. Okay? So if we think this works really well for most people, then we probably need to change it to adapt to suit the needs of the autistic person. By definition, the autistic person is not the predominant neurotype. So if it works really, really well for everybody else, then the chances are we probably need to tweak it or change it, sometimes quite dramatically, to suit the needs of the autistic person. It's a really simple concept, but actually, if you take it really on board, you begin to realize just how disadvantageous it is being autistic when almost nothing is based around what your needs are and almost entirely based around the needs of everybody else. It'd be a bit like if you're the only left-handed person in your society. So nobody bothers to make anything left-handed orientated and everything is based around being right-handed. Does that put you at a disadvantage? Absolutely it does. Is being left-handed a deficit? We don't refer to left-handed people as having a deficit in right-handedness. We refer to autistic people as having deficits in essentially the predominant neurotype. Again, lesser human beings. Golden notion: the amount of energy put into affecting change needs to warrant the intended outcome. Yes, you can make autistic kids do all sorts of things. What's the point? And I'm not saying there's never a point, but the point needs to be the benefit and well-being of that autistic child or adult, not everybody else. The most obvious one, and I quote this quite often, is forcing a child to go to assembly. Why? And you put a huge amount of effort into getting this child into assembly, and they sit there obviously really, really stressed. And then the general consensus is, right, now they've been to their first assembly, they can go again next week. And you just think, is it worth it? Is all of that energy really worth that child sitting in an environment that's clearly very distressing to them, as opposed to providing an alternative? So what does Autopia's education system look like? Access to autistic teachers. We've got to be better within higher education of supporting autistic people to become teachers, to enable a broader population of autistic teachers to subsequently teach autistic kids. I'm not saying all autistic kids need to be taught by autistic teachers, but for some that can be absolutely invaluable. Autodidactic learning opportunities, so being allowed to learn on your own, block learning for individual subjects. What about those kids who can learn during the day one subject at a time? So I'm brilliant at learning maths from 9 till 3. And then tomorrow I'll be brilliant at doing history 9 till 3. If you teach me maths 9 till 9:45, and then I've got to change to history, that's the rest of my day gone. I can't make those changes. But if you allow me to just learn on a day-to-day basis or on a term-by-term basis or whatever it might be, I'm going to be a straight A student as opposed to failing everything. Simple changes in terms of concept can make all of the difference to the autistic child within education. Sensory learning environments, we've got to start broadening our horizons in terms of how and where we teach. yurts. I love outdoor learning. I'm pointing out there because that's outdoors. With a couple of geese. Nice. Anyway, not relevant. Sorry. Yeah, I'm a big fan of going and learning in the forest or whatever it might be, and they're relatively cheap alternatives to classroom settings. Going back to my awful poem, "Conform to the Norm." If we're doing everything just in the way that we traditionally do things, we are probably putting, or very highly likely, putting our autistic kids within education at a disadvantage. Anyway, I've got to crack on. Dimmer switches are the norm, so we can actually dim these awful lights, get rid of fluorescent lights altogether. School bells are abolished. School uniform are not uniform, so not everybody has to wear exactly the same thing. Why can't we all wear onesies to school? Sorry, anyway, just a little one. But, here's one for you. If you, as an autistic child, right, learn better wearing a onesie because of the lovely sensory environment that it gives you, are we not, and if you're forced to wear a school uniform, and from a sensory point of view, that level of arousal is such that you find it difficult to learn, would it be a reasonable adjustment to allow a child to wear a onesie? Is it simple? Does it really cause a problem to anybody else? If the answer is yes, it would be a reasonable adjustment, and if we agree that it puts the child at a substantial disadvantage, forcing them to wear a school uniform, then is it not unlawful not to allow a child to wear a onesie? Now, if we said, right, okay, we can all wear whatever it is that we need to make learning more accessible, is that not better all round? Just a thought. Anyway, corridor crush is a thing of the past. Imagine, right, if you're tactile hypersensitive, so somebody brushing past you is painful. Ask autistic people, it's not uncommon at all. Then walking down that corridor in transition or in break times or whatever is torture. You're being physically abused several times a day after day after day. Going back to what I was saying earlier about destroying autistic lives, those are the sorts of things that can lead on to trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And sometimes the simplest of things can make all the difference. But we need to have a much better understanding and a much more open way of being to say it's okay to have staggered transition times. That's all it takes, staggered transition times. All it takes is somebody say, we're going to get rid of the school bell. We're not going to have it because it's painful to some people's ears. We're going to have a different way of identifying when it's beginning or the end of a lesson. It doesn't take money. It doesn't take much resource at all. It just takes a bit of imagination and innovation. Alternative assessments. We've got to get rid of, well, I was going to say we've got to get rid of exams. We don't necessarily have to get rid of exams, but we've got to have a better understanding that a range of assessments to assess knowledge is likely to benefit everybody, not just our autistic students. So you might have verbal assessment. What's wrong with giving a presentation as opposed to doing an exam, for example? This goes right across the board in terms of just how people live their lives. I'm going to come on to employment in a bit if I got the chance. Oh dear. Okay, so I can't go through everything. Just a quick one. Use of laptops in lieu of writing. Lots of autistic people are going to have difficulties with proprioception, so fine motor coordination, and some autistic people will find it incredibly difficult to write, even to the point of being painful. Does that put that individual at a substantial disadvantage? The answer is absolutely it does. Just do a simple experiment. Get an autistic person to write a sentence compared to the average non-autistic person, somebody who has difficulty with writing, and just time them. See how long it takes that autistic student to write that sentence. And what you'll find is there's a number, not invariably, but often what you'll find is it takes a child, for example, twice as long as it takes their non-autistic peers, and B, it's practically illegible, and C, the poor child is absolutely shattered by having to do it. Do those three things put that child at a substantial disadvantage compared to the non-autistic child? The answer is yes. Is it reasonable? Would it be a reasonable adjustment to teach that child to type and to offer them a laptop or computer? I'd say that's a pretty reasonable adjustment. So by not doing that, we're being unlawful. Anyway, just a quick one. Oh gosh, I haven't got time for all of these things. But okay. Oh yeah, recognition that some subjects are a waste of time for some students. It's okay to not try and force an autistic child to learn things that they have absolutely no interest in. You're much better off focusing that individual's attention to things that they're going to end up brilliant at. Anyway, remember, this is Autopia. This is my vision for the future. I know that there's a long way to go, and I'm fighting against the entire education system. But there you go. Reach for the stars, eh? Food can be consumed in many different areas. So just to put this into perspective, I know some autistic children who cannot eat at school, because the rule is that they have to eat in the canteen. They go to the canteen, they cannot eat there. For a sensory perspective, it is far too overwhelming, far too hideous. Literally, from a physical perspective, that child cannot eat. We are starving autistic children in school by having these rules. Everybody's got to do it in exactly the same way. I'm not going to get through anywhere near as much as I want to, but that's my fault for not talking quickly enough. Break time should be for relaxing, not necessarily for socialising. Socialising is way overrated, and for some autistic people it's traumatic. Break times are the worst times of school, not the best, which is sometimes the opposite for the PNT. The notion of age-related peers is recognised as nonsensical. We seem to be obsessed with year groups and age-related peers. Lots of autistic people prefer relationships with people that are older than them or younger than them, and that should be absolutely accepted for what it is. An assessment should be when the student is ready, not governed by age. I think that should be for everybody, not just autistic people. And big deep breath for you can't throw things at me because you're not here. You can virtually throw things at me if you want. Inclusion is consigned to the rubbish bin. Okay, let me explain. Attention is subsequently focused on quality of life. For example, acceptance. Being included for autistic people can simply be I feel included and accepted within this environment, as opposed to you need to be in exactly the same environment as everybody else, or whatever it might be. So it's based on acceptance, need, well-being, autistic well-being. That should be at the heart of every single thing that we do. Here's one that you can do as professionals, literally overnight. So every single meeting, every single plan, every single EHCP, anything that relates to supporting the autistic person, the very first thing, the very first heading, the very first question is every single thing that we are suggesting based on the well-being of that child? And just reflect on that throughout. If it's not, why are we doing it? Belonging and understanding, and not about everybody doing things in the same way at the same time for the same reasons. It's not going to work. I'm going to have to crack on. So Autopia's social scene, very quickly. Rejection of the notion that more friends equals happier people. It's okay not to have loads and loads of friends. Friends get in the way. Anyway, feel free to have as many friends as you like. I find it a bit of an odd notion myself, but it's perfectly okay not to have a whole plethora of friends. It's okay just to have one friend. It's okay to have no friends at all if that's your bag, and you're not seen as some kind of lesser class citizen as a direct result of that. Okay, I am going to have to crack on because otherwise I'm not going to get anywhere close to the end. Okay, so what does autistic behaviour look like? And I know there's no such thing as autistic behaviour, so bear with me. But what I mean is that if an autistic person enjoys behaving in a particular way, and stimming is the obvious example, stimming for fun and enjoyment, and yes, this is absolutely lovely, that is just absolutely accepted as part of humankind. And people aren't seen as somehow negatively odd. There's nothing wrong with being odd in terms of not part of the conformed usual way of being, but that shouldn't automatically be seen in any way, shape or form as negative. And positive behaviour must be positive for the autistic person, not just those around them. Okay, I'm going to have to crack on. Employment, just very quickly. Job descriptions should reflect specific roles, not generic skills. I'm just going to go through the main ones of this. Interviews. Let's stop interviewing people for whom it puts them at a substantial disadvantage. It's just not fair. And also, why do we interview people anyway? It seems like a very odd way of going around recruiting people, because it doesn't always work. In fact, it very often doesn't work. Being interviewed demonstrates your skills at being interviewed. If your job doesn't really involve being interviewed, it might not reflect very well in terms of how skillful you are at doing that actual job. And for many autistic people, being interviewed means that's the end of the line. It's not going to work, even though that person might be absolutely superb at doing the actual role that they're applying for. Autopia's communication system recognise the identity of non or pre-verbal autistics. Not having a voice doesn't equate to not having a say. Recognises the necessity for alternative forms of communication rather than just this obsession with language and speech. It's okay to communicate in alternative ways. Communication is far more important than, for example, language. Language is most people's preferred form of communication. That doesn't mean to say that we should treat people who don't have language as second-class citizens. And I've put at the end there, recognises that PNT social communication could be seen as utterly nonsensical, bewildering, or even traumatic. That kind of nonsensical social chit-chat. And it isn't nonsensical. There is a good purpose, good reasons behind why people talk rubbish to one another. But don't insist on the autistic person engaging with that social so-called norm, because for some people that can be seriously troubling. Okay, I'll crack on. Autopia's attitude to awesome theory and research. I'll just go on to the last bullet point there. Research should focus on what autistics and the autism community are asking for, rather than what funding is available to investigate. Currently, there's a dearth of research around autistic well-being. It's about all sorts of other things that isn't necessary or aren't necessarily on the agenda for the autistic population. So we need to have a spotlight on what are we actually doing within academia. Okay. Autopia's sensory world. Individual sensory needs are understood, accepted and catered for. Sensory differences are taken into account as the norm, and the PNT come to realise just what they're missing out on. It's a whole nother presentation of probably a day or two talking about sensory, but we've got to understand the sensory world of the autistic person, because changes in the sensory environment to suit the needs of the autistic person can be absolute game changers. And if you don't believe me, ask an autistic person. I've got to finish. There's so much I could say. I'm going to go to bed tonight stressed of all the things I haven't said. But I will finish with somebody else's words, because her words are so much better than mine. And Alicia is an autistic woman who lives in Australia, and we managed to link up, and we got on. She liked some of the writing that I'd done, and she emailed saying, I'm going to get a flight over to the UK to give you a hug. And then about 20 minutes later, she emailed again saying, oh, I've just remembered I'm quite touch aversive and I really hate hugs, so I'm not going to. But the notion was there, which I thought was lovely. I've never actually met her face to face, but we are in contact. She's an amazing human being. And she writes, the privilege of being oneself is a gift many take for granted. But for someone with autism, being allowed to be oneself is the greatest and rarest gift of all. That's amazing.